Greetings, my dear friends. I'm Gregory V. Palmer, resident bishop of the West Ohio Conference of the United Methodist Church. And I'm starting something new today, or whenever I started it, when several days before you may be viewing this Zoom video. And that is inviting some guests, colleagues, friends, maybe people that wouldn't consider me their friend, or I wouldn't consider them my friend, for deep and courageous and thoughtful conversations about the church, about the United Methodist Church, and about the relationship of faith in society. And it ought not be any secret to you that we live in a difficult and a delicate time. I'm not suggesting that the times now are worse or better than they've ever been. In fact, the Bible teaches us that really there's nothing new under the sun. But the times in which we live are critical, and they call for our engagement, and they call for us to stop tippy-toeing through the roses and to engage in the most difficult conversations perhaps that any of us have ever had, but not for the sake of saying we had a conversation and toasted some marshmallows, but for the sake of hopefully being involved in conversations in community that shaped and invited us to a transformed place in God, in Jesus Christ, in the power of the Holy Spirit. I've titled this as a placeholder of Faith and Works, and there's a reason for that. It is a placeholder, and I don't know that it'll stay the title. I hope this will go on for a long time, and I hope these will be roughly weekly conversations, 30 minutes or less with a particular guest, but I'm not promising that they'll be going next year this time, but they may be. I'm going to begin today on matters of race and policing and violence, and our relationship to that as Christians and as members of the society. But these conversations will not be isolated to that conversation. But it seems in light of what some have called the execution of Ahmaud Arbery and the murder in the hands of police of George Floyd, that it is a right time for us who follow the Prince of Peace, King of Kings, Lord of Lords, Jesus of Nazareth, for us to say, what are we being called to do, and how are we being called to act individually and collectively as the church? You know, we were coming through, I don't want to say we came as in past tense, we were finishing up the first phase of dealing with the novel coronavirus. We're still dealing with that, so don't forget that. And then an old virus, because novel means new, not seen before. We don't know much about it. And then an old virus of racism shows its ugly head in dramatic ways with some folks getting killed. And those are just placeholders. I could name Sandra Bland, and I could go back to Trayvon Martin. It's a long list. But today I've asked as my special guest, the Reverend F. Willis Johnson, who was at the epicenter of the difficult situation for years that was really lit by the killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014. Pastor Johnson is a member of the West Ohio Conference. He pastored literally across the street from the police station. He was a part of walking with people in protest, calming people in the midst of their anxiety, pain, and violence. He's gifted us by telling us his story in multiple forums, and has written a book that has been out for several years called Holding Up Your Corner. And it's part of how Christians and how United Methodists can respond in faith and faithfully to participating in building a new community. And so without further ado, I want to say welcome, Pastor Willis, to this time of conversation. And thank you for agreeing to be on and to listen to this long introduction, since this is the maiden voyage, so to speak. I hope you're well today. And I want to plunge in by saying, bring us, give us, offer us, share with us, particularly in the light of Ferguson, and seeing this over and over again, your angle of view post Brunswick, Georgia, and post the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis, Minnesota.
Well, again, thank you, Bishop, for the invitation opportunity. And we've got to stop meeting like this and conversing about such things as this. The recent occurrences, the ones that have gone viral and become apparent to all of us, continue to dishearten not only me, but so many of us. It is not only a reminder of situations, times, incidents of past, but it just, I think this more than anything in this moment has challenges us in ways that at least I hadn't experienced. Not only is it disheartening and hurtful and painful to relive much of the trauma that we've experienced, it's wearing thin the hope of so many of us. Now, I'm not saying I've suspended hope, but I can see where so many folks, and even this generation particularly, these young men and women, individuals who are now participating in acts of resistance and protest and even more extreme expressions, it's hard to discount, and it's hard to dissuade, and it's hard to explain away what seems to be more than an accident, but almost an epidemic, not of excessive abuse and subsequent tragedy happening upon Black and brown and marginalized people without reprimand, retribution, or conviction in great number. Mm-hmm. And so with that being said, it leaves us in a quagmire. It leaves us, particularly those of us who want to hold out hope, those of us who want to and are trying to live faithfully into the social contract of a democratic context and connection. And then even more so for those of us of faith who are leading and trying to have example of faith that is long suffering. It's getting hard out here for us, Pastor, to talk that talk. Mm-hmm. So we have to be mindful of that, and that's where I'm at on this day.
Sure. So there's an understandable frustration. You talk about things getting kind of thin. The rope is getting shorter. The rope is getting more frayed. The ice is getting thin. Whatever the metaphor is, because people are deeply frustrated. These, in one sense, these are, you could say they are, and I want to use quotes, isolated incidents because they happen in specific communities. And one of the things that I've been trying to invite people to understand is, but do you see the cumulative effect, particularly with 24-hour news cycles? And the other thing is the disproportionality, if you will, of you get picked up for forgery. And if there's an alleged crime, people should expect to be called into question, perhaps arrested. No apparent aggression, maybe a little agitation, reflexive responses, involuntary responses. But for passing a bad bill or a bad check, death after 9 minutes. And apparently, from all we can see, this hasn't been adjudicated yet in a court of law. We all pray that it will, but death. And that seems, it's accumulated frustration and it's disproportionate response to what any individual was arrested on. Any comments on that as to why that fuels things so much?
Well, because I think it fuels and it incites response, because one, it just don't make no sense. And we can speak to some of the most recent comparisons. When we look at people assembling, working towards and wishing to assemble, first of all, and being peaceful in however that's now defined, we don't have the same response, police response. There was not the same police response in most recent days or weeks to those militiamen and those who were openly bearing arms who were equally vehement and vicious and vulgar in their exclamations, in their espousing of their concerns and issues. Very few, if nobody, was arrested. Now, there's an argument to be said, well, how they protested was not in question and the technicalities of that. But that's just one example most recently that we can point to. Also, we can point to many examples. And I've had friends and colleagues who are not of color, who are white, who talk about their encounters with police and the expectations and the orientations around their encounters are much more different than the assumptions that lead into those encounters are, if not non-existent, they are inconsequential. I'm going to assume when I stop this individual that they have insurance. I'm assuming that where they're going is legitimate and defined. Whereas I have to ask someone of color, where are you going? Why do you live near here? These are not anecdotes of someone else's experience. These are my own encounters and my own quotes verbatim of interrogatives raised towards me or to my family, and particularly my children, or my son, I should say specifically. So, it just doesn't align. And the system, we know, it's well documented that the system is both inadequate and it is biased and more condemning of people of color. And so while these things continue to be, again, not only unacceptable, many of us have lost the words and the capacity and even the rationale for trying to even to justify or attempt to explain the indifference. There's nothing to explain anymore. It just is, and it don't make no sense.
Right. Well, you're talking about your own experiences in the body you inhabit, and I've had those experiences. I've shared those in homilies and other things, from way back when I was, 12 or 13, and where it's adequate to be stopped because the description is a big black kid, and to be a spread eagle on the front of a Philadelphia police cruiser, and then to hear the call come in. I was not beaten, no harm came to me, but it was very frightening to me as a 12 or 13-year-old on North Broad Street. And then to hear the message come across the communication system of the police, we have the suspect. Clearly it wasn't me. I was released right there, but it was embarrassing. It was on Broad Street in Philadelphia. I was walking home from the movies on a Saturday afternoon, and because I was a husky kid, as the description would have been in the 60s, it was okay to stop me. And where they found the other person was multiple blocks away, not just around the corner. And so that gets imprinted, as an adolescent in your mind. Your parents have already had to talk with you if you're in a black or a brown body and you're male. This may also be true for females, but if your parents or some elder person in your community has had to talk, now, son, when you go out and if you get stopped, so forth and so on. And some of my Anglo friends, sisters and brothers say, they've never had to have that talk with their sons or their daughters. I'm not suggesting that it's never happened, but for the most part, many of them say that's not the talk that they have. So you've talked about some of that experientially, which is always different than saying, hey, this happened to Sally or Sue, Joe or John in the media. Let me move to this question that you likely have some insight on. We know that in every context, it only takes a handful of bad actors. So let me just say it. I don't for a moment, I know you don't, believe that all police, or even the majority of the police in any place, any community, are bad people. They come in with the right heart, right mindset. They pay attention to the training, and they do many things other than arrest people. So I want to lay that out unequivocally, out of love and respect for the part they play in a civil society. The same thing can be said about the people that are protesting, that have gone to violence and the abject destruction of poverty with no direct line of sight to solving a problem. That is not the majority of the people that are peacefully protesting. And the same thing can be true about any group of people: bad acting clergy, bad acting school teachers, etc. So that said, there are good and majority good actors in both categories. In this case, police, protesters, public officials. Why do we, just as humans, get so sucked in to the bad actor narrative, but also find it so challenging to say that the bad actors must be dealt with decisively?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to offer my interpretation or suspicion. I don't know the answer.
Okay.
I think, but I deduct that it's just easier. It's just easier. The other stuff is complicated, because most of the time that's so far away from what most of us align with. It's easy to point to how that is not necessarily reflective or representative of probably ourselves in terms of who we are and what we would do. And so it's easy to say and to dismiss that, or to hold that in a light of judgment. But trying to reconcile with the fact that if I value police and if I value protest, then it gets a little bit more difficult to try to separate oneself, because that may be how I feel. That may be somebody I know. I have probably had always a good experience, or I always have good intentions when I question authority or raise or seek to speak truth to power. And so I think that's less gray for some people, and it's just easier to respond to.
So, you're a pastor, I'm a pastor, we're serving in, different roles in the life of the church and have. And one of the places that I hear a lot of frustration these days, but not the first time by any means, is you talked about a kind of a thinness. Things are getting thin in some way with people keeping hope and patience. I think that's a fair way. That's not a quote, but I think it fairly represents you. And as Christians, and you and I as preachers, and church is a place where there's a lot of speech. It's in print, it's digital. People preach, people sing, people testify, people write. There often, for many, feels like there's a kind of an irrelevance, because institutions, and the church is one, are great at words. And we should speak out in the pulpit, in our writings, lay and clergy. But I was thinking about some of the frustrations I heard in the last week of, I'm tired of words, and people are frustrated. I'm tired of justice will come, and then somebody else is exonerated. So I turned over in the book of James, and the second chapter. It's been haunting me. And I know it's in our canon, so it's a part of the Bible, y'all. And I also know that not every Christian thinker through the years has thought as much of the book of James as some others. I think Luther said something like it was a straw epistle. And he was concerned about the tension created around the faith and works things. But listen to this. I'm in the Common English Bible, chapter 2, starting at verse 14. My brothers and sisters, what good is it if people say they have faith, but do nothing to show it? Claiming to have faith can't save anyone, can it? Imagine a brother or a sister who is naked and never has enough food to eat. What if one of you said, go in peace, stay warm, have a nice meal? What good is it if you don't actually give them what their body needs? In the same way, faith is dead when it doesn't result in faithful activity. So we've all issued statements. I talked about it in a homily yesterday. Council of Bishops has issued a statement, etc. What's the faithful activity? I'm now quoting from the CEB. What would faithful activity look like for Christians in response to this?
Well, our expression of both in ministry and in consultation with folks is living out our faith is an act of resistance. Now, I tend to subscribe to a more revolutionary disposition and ideology of in terms of Christ. And I believe the gospel is not only good news and glad tidings, but it also is an expression that much of it in a teaching and a modelship of much of it being antithetical to the ways of the world. Now, that's just me. I'll go in another direction in terms of the fact that if we are people of the word, and if we are, and if our understanding of the word is such that literally everything that ever was and will be was birthed out of word, then what we say ought to evidence itself in real and tangible ways, whether that's a statement or actually the biblical narrative or writ. What we say should not just be vapor. Not only should it create the pictures and the visions or the imagery, but it should be incarnate. It should come to life. It should show itself, because we believe that that very formula is what made and provides for us, that in the beginning was the word, and the word became flesh, and the word became God. And that continues even in James when it says that our faith should be evidence. It should be exhibited. And so I don't know what that means for every person, but if what you are saying is not showing itself, okay, if what you're espousing is not showing itself, that's the place to begin to assess. Now, I could go very specific with a couple of things. For instance, there's some that would subscribe that a bank, that a checkbook and a balance sheet and a budget is a moral document. And so what we say that we believe in and what we're committed to and what we're invested in should show. And there's a lot of churches and a lot of communities who say they're invested in people, but it's only the 4 or 5, 6 or 15 people that are on staff. Because that's where the majority of the money goes. We say that we're welcoming and we're open and we're appreciative of all kinds of people. Well, you got to try real hard in the United States of America, even in West Ohio, to find places that are all people that look like you. You ain't trying real hard. So I gave a long answer, I know, but I think people of faith have to hold themselves in account to not only one particular text where I am, being benevolent and charitable and doing acts of mercy. Those are not the only works of faith. There's some other works of faith. There's some other expressions that require us. The work of faith sometimes requires us to be confrontational. The work of faith sometimes requires us to level up our privilege, or even suspend our privilege on behalf of others, which is what Paul does many times. Paul surrenders his citizenship. Okay, he takes some beatings and takes some lumps and finds himself incarcerated unnecessarily in some predicaments because he does not speak up or pull out his membership card, but instead he falls into solidarity and does life together with people, even finds himself taking charge upon himself when it's not necessary or appropriate. There's some people who have authority, but they also find themselves deferential to authority. And just all of these weighty, kind of complicated and complex kinds of relationships and interactions. It's not just in the deed or the task, but the work, I believe, of faith, or faith without works is dead, is even wrestling with question. Wrestling and being in imposition or discomforted and finding comfort and strength. When the protesters or when the activist community says we each need to do our work, some of us don't need to go and volunteer nowhere else because some of you are not helpful. You're just making yourself feel good. Okay. But the work we really need to do is the introspective work. Okay. The intentional work around our own dinner tables, on our own block. Okay. In the ways in which we are complicit, or at least complementary to the indecencies and the injustice and the inequities and the dehumanization or the disenfranchising of other folk. Because, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, we are guilty as charged.
Thank you for really expanding that conversation and reminding us that, and even the Gospels talk about repentance should have the fruit of repentance. Here, James talks about our faith should show forth in works, and our faith, I think we're called to have our faith inform every aspect of our lives. And this is not partisan, but there ought to be some lens of our faith that when we go to the polls, as well as when we go to church, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm gonna leave that alone for a moment, lest I lose this other question, which is, I've had a number of sisters and brothers, Anglo sisters and brothers, white sisters and brothers, who have said to me, others have heard it, I want to do something, I want to say something, I want to be in deep conversations. I'm afraid I'll say the wrong thing. And I've tried to entreat them to say, let's take that risk together. And I've been quoted as saying, and I've quoted another, I did this several years ago. People in West Ohio have heard it. I gave it in the Episcopal address to the general church. And that is, a pastor in Iowa said to me that our relationships, and especially in the church, are so superficial that we are not willing to risk saying something that we might have to later go back and apologize for. And that's what I mean by courageous conversations, that I might say the wrong thing on a particular subject, but what I'm committing to is I'm not going to disengage when I say the wrong thing, or if I hear something that hits me wrong. I may come and say, friend, that seemed to be in some murky territory, but I'm not disengaging from you. Let's walk that road together. And to some extent, it seems like that was one of the things you were trying to say in here, in part. Say a little bit more about what you hoped, your dream, your vision for this book as you partnered with the United Methodist Publishing House.
Well, in a general or group setting in community, we try to encourage people that, you need to be intentional or curate and make space for conversation. And when you do so, as best as possible, work towards suspending or lessening the inclination or the exercise of judgment or condemnation or questioning that if you create enough of a space or opportunity for people to share and to share their heart, understanding that sometimes we may not always have the right language or expression, but that we act, particularly people of faith, that we exercise both grace and forgiveness, understanding that this is an attempt to be genuine and forthright, then we eliminate that. Yes, I'm going to say something. If I don't know, I want to be honest and say I don't know, or this is the language, or this is the expression, or this is the words that I've been taught. They may not be correct, but this is my sharing. We try to encourage people to work within, to work respectfully and graciously in circle of making space for that, and making the space for not being right, but having a right spirit. I want to say something else that's probably not in the book, Bishop, that maybe
okay,
might
please,
be
please.
For anyone who says that, I believe that most people are genuine, that they say they want to not make a mistake. But not wanting to make a mistake is not a pass or an excuse for not trying. Okay?
Gotcha.
Okay.
Yeah.
The second part to that is there's ways to be present with people. And let's be honest, a lot of times folks are worried about saying the wrong thing or being discomforted, because if you're not seeking to be mutually responsive. So this is one of the things that is in the book. Maybe I frame it better like this. I teach young people that, and individuals, that being prophetic is not just speaking truth to power. Everybody, I'm going to go and speak truth to power. Being prophetic, and the example of the prophets, particularly the 8th century prophets, were the fact that not only did they raise, question, critique, and commentary, but they remained answerable or available. They themselves had to wrestle with the very questions, critique, and commentary that they raised against others. That was really the trepidation. And it's not just limited to 8th century prophets, but that was the focus of a lot of my scholarship. But all of the prophets, and let's go back to Moses. Moses, his greatest issue was himself, that he felt like he was not worthy to lead or speak or try to interject on behalf of the Egyptians, because one, he had been living a good life, and then two, he had fallen short in his interactions with people, and people brought that up in his face, that, dude, who are you to say what we ought to be doing, because you have done this? Well, here's the thing. If you're going to ask a question, you got to be willing and ready to be able to answer that question yourself. Okay? And so often people who are been marginalized or victimed, or who are constantly under scrutiny and attack, when you sit at the table and try to say, well, why is this and why are you doing this? Well, you need to be ready to have a question thrown back to you. That's what happened. That's the part that people miss, and I'm sorry, Bishop, but we've been having this rehearsed quote of King lately, that riot is the voice, but it's actually the riot is the language of the unheard. People don't go on and read further that presentation, because he makes that statement basically in response or rebuttal to the fact that, okay, if you're going to hold and question and analyze why people are responding the way they're responding, you also need to be open to the questioning of the causation, or what is provoking or moving people to such a desperate or demonstrative or necessary means to get attention or to make known their aches and their anxiety or their hardship. And too often, I'm sorry, we do this a lot in our connection. There's a lot of encounters in processes as well as in natural relationships where people sit back in this kind of clinical posture. Okay. Once you pass the board of ordained ministry, don't be sitting up here asking me questions and interrogating me. because I'm going to ask you some questions back. Well, why do you do this and that in your community? Well, why do you do this and that? Why do all the black kids eat at the lunch table together? Well, why do all the white people live in the same subdivision and don't let all the black people live there? Mm-hmm. I can't find, I try and I want to do this, but my community is, 90-something% what it is. Well, have you ever thought about how if you are a numeric minority, not only in this country, but on this planet, that you have found the needle in the haystack by finding a place where only white people live and breathe and act and dress like you, and you don't find that to be a problem until you see me? See, those are the questions in the interrogation that needs to be self-initiated. And if you are willing to do that with yourself or be open to that kind of, not confrontation, but that kind of orientated space of engagement, then you will find that whatever you say will be respected, or at least it will be heard differently than what usually transpires when we have these kind of conversations. And the last part, don't, I know it's well-meaning, but if you don't know, if you've got a relationship, I have people who ask me all the time, Willis, what can I do? What can I do? What do I need to read? That's fine. That's one thing. But let's be honest about it. You know enough people, or should ought to be asking each other, what y'all need to do different. And I may be out of order, Bishop, but Bishop, what should I be doing? Man, come on, you the pastor. Mm-hmm. You want a multicultural church? Go make some multicultural friends. Mm-hmm. And how do you do that? Mm-hmm. You probably go and try. And one last thing, I said that 3 times now. You probably need to ask people more about their story and who they are. Because most people assume that people are what they think they are. Mm-hmm. And there's a whole lot of folk who don't look like what they've been through and who don't look like what you think they are.
Man, I thank you for the depth and the breadth and the candor of your response. And I'm going to draw this to a close because you've taken us to a place where we're stirred up in our thinking and in our feeling, and that's exactly where we need to be. I want to remind those who view this, I want to say thank you for doing it. I want to say thank you to Dr. F. Willis Johnson. I want to remind you of a number of statements that have been made, and that the United Methodist Church, in its frailty and its feebleness, has declared that racism is a sin. And I'm looking for that bright day when we will say articulately that if that be the case, and it is the case, that racism is a sin. It is demonic. And I am waiting on the United Methodist Church, not just because of Brunswick, Georgia, or Minneapolis. I can give you the litany of history since the beginning of Methodism in America and of all of the predecessor bodies of United Methodism. We need to commit, in my judgment, my humble judgment, to becoming an anti-racist institution, which means we will participate in dismantling racism. I don't have any expectation that that's going to happen in my lifetime. But I do have an expectation that I might see some of the buds coming out that we are dismantling racism. And I am not failing in cognizance that there's a lot that's different than it was 50 years ago, 30 years ago, 100 years ago. But I want to say, as Paul said, let's finish the work so that we can take on the next challenge. Remember, this is Courageous Conversations about Faith and Work. I want to end with our friend and our brother, the writer of the book of James, that says, what good is it if you don't actually give somebody who says they're hungry something to eat or clothes if they are ill-clothed? And then he says in verse 17 of chapter 2, in the same way, faith is dead when it doesn't result in faithful activity. Dr. Willis, thank you. Saints of God, thank you. God bless all of you. and God keep you.